Sorry for the delayed update. It's been a long couple of days stuck in port. I really had no chance to respond to comments on the last update. I'll start right off where I left off. I stood for a moment in my stateroom, still trying to piece everything together. Then, beyond the murmur of voices on the walkie, I heard the light moans. It was them. I couldn't tell each sound apart, but I knew it was the three of them. I had to believe it was. I snatched up the walkie. I was sure to turn the audio down a bit, grabbed the bag I had filled with supplies and left the room. I set out to try my best to think of where they could be. It was 5 a.m. We were set to be in port by 7 a.m. That did not leave a lot of time, especially if any of what Sol had said was true. I listened intently to the walkie as I made my way down the hall away from the room. I didn't hear much. It sounded like the walkie on the other end was covered in something preventing the audio from coming through cleanly. Suddenly the boat lurched, hard enough that I slammed to the left against the wall. I could only assume those on the other side of the walkie-talkie had the same experience, as there was a muffled exclamation. The next words that I heard were from a familiar voice, and they came through the walkie crystal clear, almost as if they were said right into it, or at least very close.
Damn! What the hell was that? Do you think we should check with the engineers above us, on 3?
I heard some distant murmuring that I couldn't make out, followed by a brief pause.
Understood. If it happens again, I'll head up.
It seemed also too coincidental, but at least I knew where to go. Floor 2. A big what-if popped into my head. What if this is a trap? Could I be walking into my own death? Like I said, I wasn't going to leave without them, and I was prepared to die trying. Against my better judgment, I pulled myself off the wall and pressed forward. I made my way towards the staircase near the elevators. Stepping lightly, I made my way down. As I turned to leave the 5th floor and proceed downwards, the nice grand staircase ended and I found myself facing a more rustic, all-white door with a turnable wheel in the middle to open it. I briefly scanned the platform above me to make sure no passengers were nearby. Then I grabbed onto either side of the cold metal wheel. With a firm grasp, I tried to turn it. My muscles strained and I was doing all I could to not make any sound as my body heaved against it. Just as my muscles began to ache and was about to give up and find an alternative route down, the wheel began to move, groaning loudly as it did. Try as I might, there was no way to avoid the almost harmonic French horn-sounding groan it gave off. I scanned the area one last time and saw no one coming. Giving up all notions to maintain my stealth, I twisted hard and fast. The sound began to let up, and the wheel started turning more freely. It reminded me of starting a car and trying to turn the wheel in the few moments that the power steering was kicking in. At last, the door popped open. A cold draft followed it, and I found myself staring into nothing but darkness. Assuming I would no longer need it to blow up anything, I took out the flashlight and flipped it on, hoping against hope no one was staring back at me from the depths I was looking into. I stepped in and closed the door gently behind me. I chose not to relatch it from the other side to prepare for what I was expected to be a hasty escape. I paused and pressed the walkie up to my ear to listen and see if there was any status change on the other side. Beyond soft murmurs, there was nothing of note. I could still hear the faint moaning, so I knew that nothing had happened to the group, at least not yet. I moved my flashlight around. A beam of light straight in front of me illuminated the floating dust particles in the stairwell, and really nothing out of the ordinary beyond that. It was like any standard set of stairs in a building, but they were all white and all steel. Between each door, the stairway would go down to a platform. In other words, it was just 2 flights of stairs to get from one floor to the next. I started down. My steps, no matter how quietly I tried to move, echoed all the way through the confines of the stairwell. I kept the walkie close to my head, and my stomach dropped when I heard an unfamiliar voice say loudly in a half-chuckle,
"So let's start with the big guy."
I tried my best to keep my emotions under control, but my movements down the staircase quickened, and the clanging sound of my steps around me increased. I hoped that if anyone heard me, the bouncing sound of my footsteps would give them no definitive indication of where I was. I moved past floor 4, then the platform before 3, all the while keeping the speaker of the walkie-talkie pressed hard against my ear. I could hear what sounded like a tray being set down on the other side of the walkie, and the unmistakable clang of metal on metal. Floor 3 went by, and I practically jumped down the next 2 flights of stairs, landing with a hard thack in front of the door to floor 2. I stood, bracing myself as the sound reverberated around me and up the stairwell, eventually fading into silence. The door in front of me was not the same as the others I had passed. It looked more like a contemporary door. Shaking, I grabbed the knob and turned it quietly. I pressed the door open just a crack. As it opened, light from the floor cut through the darkness I was standing in. With no need for it at this point, I shut the flashlight off and pushed the door open slowly, stepping through to observe my surroundings. There were rooms on this floor. Staterooms. I realized quickly I was in the staff quarters and couldn't shake the feeling that this area seemed somehow familiar. But I was pretty sure I hadn't been here before. Adrenaline began to course through my veins. I was so close I could feel it with every step, every breath. I stepped forward and almost lost my balance as the boat slowed. We're starting to slow into port. I figured we were a mile or so out at most. My time was running short. I turned down the walkie to its quietest setting, aside from off, and jammed it hard against my ear. I heard a second unfamiliar voice say,
"You won't feel a thing, big guy."
I imagine this is what I had watched the doctor mouth to his victim on the screen the first night when I couldn't hear him. Macabre visions danced through my head of that man on the bed and on the TV in my room. The feed played through my head again and again as I kept moving. Only this time, it wasn't some random person in my vision. It was my group, sitting there, a knife inching closer and closer to their skin. Just as quickly as the thought of their blood sloshing around a white container entered my mind, I forced it back out and pressed on. I had seconds at best. I moved down the hallway, the even room numbers counting up on the left. I knew exactly where I was going. The same place Sol had been telling me to go since the first night. He made sure I had no chance of forgetting it. The layout of the ship in this area wasn't super straightforward, so I'll do my best to describe it below. After passing 5 doors, the hallway in front of me bent 90 degrees to the right. Around that corner, one hallway went straight before turning to another sharp right. Before that right turn in the middle of the hallway, another hallway took a quick 90-degree bend to the left. You could also think of it as a sideways Y, except there were 90-degree angles instead of forks from the main stem. If I get a chance, I'll try and upload a diagram to give a better idea. I walked down the hallway, passing the 5 doors on my left. 220, 222, 224, 226. Where I expected to see 228, I instead saw an oddly shaped unmarked door. It was metal, and instead of a standard stateroom doorknob, it had one of those metal push bars to open it. I thought about pushing it for a second, but I didn't. Instead, I turned around and looked at the hallway that continued behind me. And I'm glad I did. Standing there at the end of the hallway, it was facing me. Room 228. I listened on the walkie-talkie and heard 100% silence. No moaning, no voices, nothing. I made my way to the door. Quietly and nervously placed an ear up to it. I heard what sounded like several agitated voices and one pleading voice, but I could not make out who it was. For a brief moment, I was unsure I was in the right spot. until I heard footsteps fast approaching the door. I stepped back into the hallway behind me and to the left, just as the door opened. I stood silently, not breathing, with my back pressed against the wall, until a bald man in a white jacket with circle frame glasses and a white goatee walked by. My heart sank. His once white jacket already had a small amount of wet blood on it. I was too late for somebody. He went off stomping as he took a turn back up the way I had come. I heard the door from that hallway open and close. Then I heard nothing. I stepped up to the door of room 228. I realized I hadn't really planned anything to this point. You guys have pointed out that I have made more than a few moves throughout this ordeal that have tread the line between bravery and idiocy. Hopefully, this will be the last one. I held up the walkie-talkie. I had to assume that since I could no longer hear anything through it, the communication button was no longer being held down. This meant that they could hear if I talked through it, but more importantly, they could receive a page from my walkie. Bring, bring, bring. I could hear it through the wall, followed by loud clambering. After several loud rings, the chirping stopped. Half expecting someone to say something on the other end, I pressed the walkie back against my ear. I then realized what was about to happen, and wedged the walkie-talkie away from my face, stepped out from where I was hiding and threw it hard down the hallway. As it soared down the hall, and I jumped back to my not-so-hidden hiding spot, I heard it calling out as the other one had. The door burst open and I heard footsteps running towards where I threw it. I was lucky, but it wasn't good enough. I needed a louder distraction, something that would get them further away from that door and down another hallway, the one I had originally come from and the one where the doctor went. I had to throw something else. The flashlight? No, I needed that to get out. The pen. It's not even close to loud enough. The marbles. With little hesitation, I carefully pulled the marbles out of the bag and ripped the satchel open that contained them. I didn't have much time. The walkie was no longer ringing and I had expected to hear footsteps heading my way at any moment. I gently and quietly dumped as many of those glistening orbs into my cupped hand as I could, being careful not to overflow and give my position away prematurely. I tossed them as hard as I could down the hall where the doctor had gone, and where I had come from. It was as loud as hell, louder than the walkie-talkie had been, and I expected to start seeing stateroom doors opening to investigate. None did. The only thing I did hear were loud footsteps making their way toward me. With my back pressed firm against the wall, I waited. Within seconds, two nicely dressed men rushed past me down the hall. This was it. It was now or never. I made my move and swooped into the room, not hesitating when I realized Sol had never left. I soon saw why. There were my friends chained up, and Sol, unconscious on the ground on the left side of the room. He was lightly bleeding from his arm, not the same way as the video I had seen. He had been stabbed and the knife was still in his arm. It was sticking out of the back of his arm, about 3 inches above the elbow. Based on his weird positioning, I could only assume he had been stabbed defending himself. The inside of the room was pretty much what I expected. It was much larger than the video had made it seem. There were 3 additional beds, one on the far right was empty. The carpet had been stripped away and I saw those 2 white bins. 8 of them, 2 each for my friends, and 2 extra under the empty bed. I still had to get my friends out and to safety, quick, and I knew I couldn't do it alone. I walked over to Sol, and with little remorse, I yanked out the knife. He groaned loudly and clutched his arm. Then he opened his eyes and looked up. When he saw me, he smiled. "Oh, good. You made it." I didn't have time to ask him what he meant or what had happened. "I guess you really do need my help," I said as I began to help him up. Just as I got him on his feet, I felt that feeling again. The same feeling I felt that first night. The room dimmed as the doorway became blocked. Shadows dipped over the room in an irregular fashion from the light that had been streaming in. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I turned to slowly look. Too late. There they were, staring back at me. It felt like I was watching everything all over again on the TV in my room. This time there was no screen to protect me. There was no ancient tic-tac to press down on and make it all go away. It wasn't grainy, and it wasn't black and white.
When you're right, Saul. A few minutes late, but at least he's here now,
he said, staring into my eyes.
And thanks to your little display, we'll have 5 skulls to hand over. They'll love that,
he said, turning briefly to Saul. I felt a despair unlike any I have ever felt. Like Satan himself had just walked in the room. Only there were 3 of him. It was suiting since my life had been utter hell for the last several days. In that moment, I thought about my friends, and about all of you. I should have just kept my mouth shut. I should have just endured it until it was over and I had gotten back home. But I didn't, and now I was here. I had lost, and I figured at this point I would be lucky just to have it done quickly. I looked at Saul, and there was no half-enthused look about him anymore. He looked entirely defeated. I still don't know why he'd been on the floor when I came in, but I could only assume something had gone wrong with his plan, and he was as dead as the rest of us. The light from the hallway poured in against the dim ambience of the room. I could barely make out the half-smiles on their faces as they started towards us. I'll never forget what happened next. Saul sprang forward and charged towards them. I suddenly realized why this area seemed so familiar. The oddly shaped door at the end of the hall was where we disembarked the previous day. Rachel, Sarah, and I must have come from a different direction. I didn't really have a choice. I charged too, but was knocked back off my feet by the younger of the 2 nicely dressed men. I was finally able to see his face. It was familiar, though I couldn't remember exactly where I had seen it. Looking back at me for a brief moment, he almost had an apologetic look about him. I laid there and flinched, expecting to get attacked by someone, but all I heard was a commotion moving away from me. I opened my eyes. Saul was looking at me pleadingly over his shoulder, wrestling the doctor backwards towards the oddly shaped door. The other man, the one who had knocked me off my feet, dressed nicely in what I now recognized was first officer attire, was pushing against the heavy-set man with all of his might. I fought past them, kicking loose marbles out of the way as I did. I found myself in front of an oddly shaped door. I gave the handle a hard push. With a loud pop, the rubber seals surrounding the frame of the door released their grasp, and the door opened just a few feet above the waterline. I got out of the way just as a heavy-set man and the doctor were pushed through, followed briefly by screams, a splash, and the lonely silence of waves crashing against the ship. We watched out the door as the 2 men surfaced and struggled to stay afloat. Whatever sound they were trying to make was drowned out by the roar of the motor of the ship and their own choking from the unexpected intake of seawater. Watching them was a somber experience. I almost felt like I was staying still and the sea was moving them, carrying them and all the evil shit they had done away from us for good. They were off the ship, but they weren't dead. I looked at Saul to ask him what his next move was, but his eyes fixed on something out the door. Something beyond the flailing men in the water. For the first time since I had seen him on the trip, he looked relieved. It was almost like watching the dark circles under his perpetually bloodshot eyes disappear, as if a huge weight had been lifted. I followed his gaze until I saw it. Quietly and quickly, a small boat came around the end of the ship, pulled up next to the struggling men. I'll never forget seeing the 100 of skulls that were displayed on some sort of crude netting system on the side of the boat. Some were no more than a few cracked fragments bound loosely by frayed wire, while others seemed chillingly fresh. For a brief moment, I wondered if that poor soul I saw on the first night might be one of the fresher ones. Almost as quickly as the boat moved in, some men on it scooped the 2 flailing men out of the water, and they were gone. The 3 of us went back inside. After getting him patched up, I talked with Sol and First Officer Henry as we got my friends to where they needed to be. Turns out there is a service elevator, so we were able to navigate relatively unseen. For the few people that did see us and ask what we were doing, it was pretty easy to explain away my friend's condition as a long night of partying, coupled with a serious case of seasickness. The doctor, who was actually a doctor on the ship, ran a drug cartel in Latin America and was using this ship as a vessel for transport. Lured in by profits, Sol, the captain, and the first officer were initially on board. He was known as the Doctor and pretty much ran the show in most towns along the coast. Obviously, the Doctor knew the risks of trading drugs on the seas and how easy of a target a slow-moving cruise ship would be, so he enlisted help. Over time, the help started to demand more: drugs, alcohol, and eventually lives. Sol and the first officer had made the decision that no amount of money was equivalent to human life and the moral anguish that accompanied it. As the demands rose from 1 skull, 2 skulls, and beyond, Sol and the first officer hatched a plan. They essentially just needed a 3rd person to open the door. That was me. I asked why they didn't want someone who works on the boat to help. They said it was just too risky. They had to get a person like me because I had collateral, people with me, and my willingness to help would be based on saving that collateral, rather than trying to profit off the situation. Most workers on the cruise line are alone, so there's not much to hold over their head in getting them to help. They'd spent the first day looking for groups of people that fit the bill. Call it morality or whatever you want in this fucked up situation, Sol and Henry did not want to involve any children, so they avoided families. Once they identified people that would work, they sent the feed to their rooms that night. I'll never know if I was the only one to see it. I just happened to be the only one stupid enough to talk about it in a public setting. I also asked how no one on that floor heard us and came to investigate throughout the ordeal. Well, it's the same reason that no one ever discovered them when they were doing their ritual. The days arriving and leaving from port are the busiest for the crew, so they're all out of bed and working by that time. Next, I asked why he was on the floor when I got into the room. The doctor had grown impatient with him that I wasn't there yet. He started cursing at Sol and eventually attacked him. Sol blocked his swipes but ended up getting stabbed in the arm. The doctor grabbed the closest, heaviest thing he could and hit Sol with it. When he collapsed to the ground, the walkie popped out and the doctor realized what was going on. As for why the doctor had left, he was coming for me. I don't want to think what would have happened if he turned down the hall I was hiding in, instead of continuing straight. I'm sure he hoped to grab me in the darkness of the stairwell. I get chills thinking about it. Next, I asked about the clerk, how he knew to give me the note, and if Sol was his boss. He wouldn't give a lot of information here. Instead, he smiled and said, "Sometimes it's best not to share everything about the plan, and to make sure that you know something that no one else does." He used my own words against me, and it made me a little uneasy. I wonder how much he actually knew, but I didn't ask. He probably wouldn't have told me anyways. The last thing I asked was how he set things up with the pirates. He said that basically the agreement with them was a sort of blood contract. One of the pirates that set it up has to die to break it. There were a lot of other questions I thought of after we parted ways. What if I didn't leave Deck 15 that night? What if the doctor had found me when I left the room? Why did they drain blood from people before handing them over? He gave me a P.O. Box mailing address, though he asked not to share it. Maybe if I decide I want to hear the truth behind some of those questions, I'll write him. Part of me is too scared to hear him say, "Just be glad that didn't happen." He wasn't lying when he told me it wasn't personal. Any one of the other people they had identified could have been channel surfing that first night. It just happened to be me. He also wasn't lying about something else. I never did have to kill anyone. I just had to open the door. My conscience was at least somewhat clean realizing this, even if I was still technically an accomplice. He was right when he said my friends were helping in a different way. My life was barely ever on the line. I could have left and never come back, and that would be it. But the three of them were down there enduring God knows what. In the end, Saul and the first officer, Henry, set everything up. The item Saul had me get led me down there, along with his little hints along the way. Well, except for the iPhone charger. I asked him why that was on the list, and he innocently said he accidentally tripped over mine and broke it whilst he was in my room. It's funny to think I ever actually believed I would be blowing anything up with a phone charger, marbles, and a flashlight. Shows how much I know about explosives. In any case, Saul assured me they would be retiring and scrapping the boat. They're investigating everything, but are planned to label the doctor and the captain's death as horrible accidents once searches for their bodies in the water come up empty, which they will. Sad to know some people will pour their souls out for him though. They're not reporting any other deaths. Saul and First Officer Henry cleared our names entirely and acted like they didn't even know us as anything more than passengers when we had to talk to the port officials. We were stuck in port for a few days whilst they did an investigation, hence the delayed update. I don't know exactly what he told the port officials about what happened, but Saul and First Officer Henry were the last people any witnesses had seen with the captain and the doctor. I imagine they already knew what they were going to tell the officials well before I was even on the boat. I'm on a plane home now. We all are. I'll never forget about this cruise. I wasn't surprised when I asked Rachel about how she managed to grab the walkie-talkie whilst being kidnapped, and she replied, "I didn't. I don't even remember being kidnapped." I assume, like many of you did, that something was in the water. It seems like an unnecessary risk, but whomever did it probably knew that I would be too paranoid to drink it. Another question for Saul, I suppose. I found some strange resolve thinking that a lot of people don't even realize the danger they were in on this cruise. For them, this was a nice vacation. For us, it was memorable, at least. Well, thanks again for everything, Reddit. You guys are amazing. If I am ever in trouble again, I know that the depths of no sleep is a safe place for me to go. I could feel my eyes beginning to droop. Looks like days of no sleep for me are finally coming to an end. I know what questions you may have. Will I ever go on a cruise again? I think so. If anything, I kind of feel like I'm owed one. Just maybe somewhere different, like Alaska. Not sure how many ice pirates there are out there. I just know that I never want to see those skulls again. I'd encourage anyone to cruise in the future, even after this. You just might want to think twice if you decide to do some late-night channel surfing. Rachel just passed my drink over from the flight attendant. I'm going to enjoy this whiskey, and more importantly, finally enjoy a nice long sleep on the flight home.